Dr. Atchison here, and we're talking about Chapter 10, Motivation and Emotion. We're talking about the need to belong. So we've already discussed Maslow's hierarchy of needs. The need to belong falls in this kind of third category, the belongingness and love needs. So again, even Maslow identified this as an important need, as a kind of important step for motivation. That we need love and to be loved, to belong and to be accepted, and we need to avoid loneliness and alienation. So the affiliation need is the need to build relationships and be part of a group. And this really has a lot of evolutionary support for our survival. It's easier to fight, it's easier to hunt, it's easier to gather food when you're doing it with other people. And that increases the survival and the reproduction of the social group. We also have an innate need to belong, and this drives us to befriend those who cooperate with us and avoid those who don't. This is where we start to get this us versus them stuff that we'll talk about more in the social chapter. And it's also important to note that this kind of also talks a little bit about the stuff that we talked about in terms of attachment. So when we looked at Harlow's monkeys, this was looking at this innate need to belong, this innate need to kind of have this kind of relationship, even if it was just with a wire monkey covered in cloth. That was a piece of it, that was kind of an innate need. Again, humans are still very social beings, even though we don't need to kind of have the same hunting group or the same be the part of the same army as we may have needed to be in our evolutionary past. This social being really is a continuation. And this need to belong really affects our thoughts, our emotions, and our behaviors. And so that's why it's in this motivation chapter, because it really can be a motivation for behavior. And we can talk about it in terms of some of the pro-social kinds of behaviors that we talked about a little bit already in the learning chapter. That again, sometimes these pro-social behaviors are a function of this need to to belong, this function of this motivation to be in relationship with others. We know that feelings of love activate the brain reward systems and the safety systems. And this is not necessarily just romantic love. This is also can be familial love. This can be friendship love. It's again that relationship. And again, this can go back to that kind of attachment piece too, that this feeling, this needing to belong, again, really can activate parts of the brain that are usually set up for reward systems and to keep us safe. Social isolation, we see, really can increase the risk of mental health and decline. We see, especially in elderly populations, when they do not have social interactions, there's lots of really negative outcomes from that, including mental decline, including poorer health. There's more and more research that really social piece is a really important part of our health. And so again, they're starting to look at that more especially in the U.S., who have an aging population, as a way to kind of keep this social isolation from happening, because we know of its role in mental decline and health. Another example of this is that children that are put through a series of foster homes or repeated family locations end up having problems forming really deep attachments because they're never given the opportunity to kind of have that long-term opportunity to form that deep attachment. And as we talked about in the attachment chapter, when we talked about attachment with development, attachment is kind of that blueprint for future relationships. And so again, children need that ability to kind of form that clear, deep attachment as a blueprint for as life continues. The most extreme version of social isolation is ostracism. This is deliberate exclusion from social interactions or group. And it can be done in a formal situation. It can be done in a not formal situation. So your book talks about a West Point student, Henry Flipper, who they ostracized him because they wanted him to drop out because of his race. He actually didn't and became the first African American West Point graduate. But there was a lot of risks that he took emotionally by enduring that ostracism. So being socially excluded, this ostracism really threatens our need to belong. And we know that there is actually real pain experienced in social isolation. This is not like, oh, my, heart hurts. There's physical pain that can accompany this. We know this because of increased activity in brain areas, such as the anterocingulate cortex, which is the area of the brain that's responsible for pain response. We also know this because Tylenol, the generic form of that acetaminophen, can lessen social pain as well as physical pain. So again, we see that there is real pain associated with this. And across cultures, some cultures actually describe social pain with the exact same words that they use for physical pain, that they don't differentiate between them the way that we do in our language. And social exclusion really may interfere with developing empathy for others. We can have increased aggression, and we can really raise the risk for these kind of self-defeating behaviors of learned helplessness and other kind of underperformance. So worldwide, there's lots of different forms of ostracism, exile, imprisonment, solitary confinement. Even for children, a brief time out in isolation really can be punishing. We'll also see ostracism sometimes as a form of social aggression. So again, like they talked about in the book about the West Point student, Henry Flipper, that was a form of social aggression as a way to say, okay, and it can be in a social setting that's not something like exile or imprisonment or solitary confinement in a more formal setting, but just as a negative consequence for whatever deemed it can be. We see this a lot in bullying. This kind of ostracism, not pretending someone's not there. We'll see it kind of, ignoring people completely. These kinds of things are forms of ostracism that we're seeing in our schools as a form of social aggression. Social isolation and rejection really foster depressed moods or can kind of create a really flat emotional affect, a kind of a numbness. It can also trigger aggression. So this is really not good for really anyone involved. So it really is a very unhealthy thing to kind of be in social isolation. And again, isolation can put us at risk for mental decline and ill health, which we've already discussed in some piece or rather. The final thing that I wanted to talk about in terms of the need to belong is the new advent of a way that we connect with each other now, social networking, and how it works with social effects. So really, the advent of the internet really has changed a lot on how we connect with other people. And so there's been a lot of research questions that have kind of come up to to try and figure out, is this a good thing? Is this a bad thing? How does this change our interaction? How does this change what's going on? So the questions are we more or less socially isolated than we were before the internet and social networking? Does electronic communication stimulate healthy self-disclosure? Do social networks reflect actual personalities? So is your profile and what you do on your profile indicative of who you really are? Or is that kind of a second self, or you're putting yourself out there the way you want to be seen? And does social networking produce or promote narcissism? Narcissism is that idea that you like to be the center of attention. People who are narcissistic are more self-important, they're more self-focused, they're more self-promoting. And again, this is not a great thing. And we've heard narcissism mentioned a lot in the 2016 presidential election. There have been some psychologists that have discussed, possible diagnoses of narcissism and in regards to Donald Trump. And so this is the idea is, are we more likely to become more narcissistic from engaging in social networking? So for the first question, are we more or less socially isolated? Again, this internet social networking is really still driven by this affiliation need. So the reason that you go on and you check Facebook is because you want to be connected to other people. And mostly what we see is it really strengthens connections. It really doesn't make us more isolated. It can mostly strengthen the connections, but with people we already know. Okay? So I know in my personal life, I've lived in Texas. We lived in California for a while. We now live in Georgia. And so I have lots of friends kind of all over the country, and lots of friends that I probably wouldn't still be friends with, air quotes, if it weren't for social networking. I'm able to kind of have a deeper connection with some of these people than I would ordinarily have because of our distance. And so mostly we see that social networking and things like Facebook and Instagram and these things really can strengthen connections with people we already know. Does electronic communication stimulate healthy self-disclosure? Again, it mostly strengthens these connections with people we already know. And one of the reasons it does this is because we see more self-disclosure on these settings. It needs to be done in a really healthy way, but we see that self-disclosure strengthens relationships. And again, when this is done in a healthy way, we can see positive situations. The problem is when people don't necessarily engage in self-disclosure in a healthy way, and then there can be negative consequences because it is the internet and there are trolls, even if they're your friends. And so again, there can be, it's kind of a give and take there. Do social networks reflect our actual personalities? Actually, they are pretty accurate. You may think that you're doing a really good job of putting up what you want your personality to be, but when you take into account your comments and your likes and your dislikes and how you behave within the system, it's actually pretty accurate in terms of your personality, and it's also pretty accurate in terms of likability with other people. So these social networks are actually, we act like that this is all fake, but a lot of times they can be very accurate representations of one's personality. Does the social networking promote narcissism? Yes, it actually increases narcissism. They did a study in 2010, and they looked at, they had two groups of people. They had them randomly assigned to one group or the other. One group spent 15 minutes working on their Facebook profile, and the other group spent 15 minutes navigating and trying to explain a Google Maps routing. Okay, so they're both on the internet, they're both doing things, but one of them is something that's really reflective on just themselves, and the other thing is kind of more, a little bit more outward focusing or more neutral. And what they found is after the task, they were tested, and the students who had engaged in the Facebook profiles had, working and explaining and editing their Facebook profiles, actually had higher narcissism ratings than those who had been working on Google Maps. And again, these were randomly assigned. So these were not, this was not people got to choose. And so, the people who chose Facebook were more narcissistic. This was after 15 minutes of working on one's profile. These were scoring more narcissistic. So we do see that social networking can produce narcissism. And again, it's all about a healthy balance with this. We do know that face-to-face still beats online for the most rewarding social interactions, the most rewarding for filling that affiliation need, that need to belong. Your text talks about different ways to kind of monitor and balance and focus with social networking in our lives, and ways to kind of balance that so that we can, again, have this benefit of face-to-face. So when you're at dinner with a bunch of friends and you're all on your phones, you're missing out because we do know that face-to-face interaction and face-to-face communication and face-to-face relationships is greater than social networking. It's going to beat it every single time in terms of reward, in terms of mental health, in terms of benefits, all these things. So this ends our lecture on the need to belong. Thanks.